Somewhere in America right now, a woman is doing math she should not have to do. She has 2 cats. She has had them since they were kittens. Their names are on her emergency contact card. She has spent more on their veterinary care than she has spent on her own. She considers them family in a way that is not metaphorical. She means it the way a person means it when they say family. And this month, her landlord is charging her an extra $75 on top of her rent. Not because she damaged anything. Not because the cats made noise. Simply because they exist. A monthly fee for the act of owning a pet, paid every month, indefinitely, as a condition of keeping her home and keeping her cats. In some American cities, she cannot even find an apartment that will let her through the door. Only 20% of San Francisco apartments allow cats and dogs of any size, 26% in Los Angeles. In a state where 70% of renters own pets, that is 12 million people paying rent in California who have a pet. The housing market has functionally decided that the majority of them have a problem that needs to be solved with either fees, restrictions, or rejection. The pet tax is not coming. It is here. It has been here for years. And the debate about what it costs, who pays it, and whether the government should regulate it or expand it is one of the most consequential policy fights that nobody is talking about, clearly. Because on one side is a legitimate question about property rights, housing costs, and who bears the financial burden when an animal damages a carpet or a wall. And on the other side is a question about what kind of society charges people a permanent monthly luxury surcharge for the emotional bond they have formed with a living creature. Both questions are real. And right now, across America, they are colliding. 66% of American households own a pet. That is 86.9 million households. Americans spent an estimated $150 billion on pet care in 2024. The pet industry is larger than the film industry, larger than the music industry, larger than most things Americans associate with major cultural and economic weight. And 88.8% of dog owners and 84.7% of cat owners describe their pet as a member of the family, not a possession, not a hobby. Family. That number matters, because it explains why the pet tax debate has emotional stakes that most housing policy debates do not. When a government or a landlord decides to impose fees on pet ownership, they are not regulating a consumer product. They are, in the perception of the majority of American households, placing a surcharge on a family relationship. And the people who pay that surcharge, disproportionately lowered income renters. Disproportionately, people in competitive urban housing markets are not paying it voluntarily. They are paying it because the alternative is surrendering the animal or losing their home. Individuals earning less than $50,000 are more likely to encounter pet-related housing restrictions and are more frequently affected by the cost of veterinary care when deciding whether to adopt a pet. Since 2019, prices of services like veterinary care and grooming have gone up 42%, with the cost of goods like food and treats surging 22%. The main reason for pet surrender, according to shelter staff, is I can't afford it. 5.8 million dogs and cats entered shelters and rescues in 2024 approximately. 607,000 animals were euthanized in shelters in 2024. Those 607,000 deaths are not abstract statistics. They are the downstream consequence of a system in which owning a pet has become financially punishing enough that hundreds of thousands of people could no longer sustain it. The pet tax, in the form of monthly pet rent, non-refundable fees, breed restrictions, and blanket no-pet policies, is one of the mechanisms producing those deaths. Not the only one, but one of them. Here is what the money actually looks like. In a typical American city today, renting an apartment with a pet means paying a pet deposit, typically $200 to $500, which may or may not be refundable, plus monthly pet rent of $25 to $100 per animal per month. For a 2-cat household in a mid-range apartment, that is $50 to $200 per month in fees, in addition to everything else. Over the course of a 1-year lease, that is $600 to $2,400 in pure pet surcharges, on top of food, veterinary care, and every other cost of keeping an animal alive and healthy. For a household earning $40,000 a year, that is not trivial. That is a meaningful percentage of disposable income, paid not for any service or benefit received, but simply for the right to keep living with an animal you already own. And that is if the landlord will let you in at all. The National Apartment Association reports that most apartment communities allow pets but may have restrictions. The reality on the ground, especially in high-cost markets, is substantially less pet-friendly than that framing suggests. Renters in San Francisco and New York describe the experience of apartment hunting with a pet as a second job. A large dog, over 25 pounds, over 50 pounds. Over whatever arbitrary threshold a particular building has decided constitutes a problem, eliminates most of the available inventory. In many cities, before the application is even submitted. This is where the individual freedom argument enters. The landlord owns the property. The landlord has a legitimate interest in protecting it from damage. Animals can and do cause damage. Chewed baseboards, stained carpets, scratched floors. Non-refundable fees and monthly pet rent exist to compensate for real costs. The person who chose to get a pet knew, or should have known, that pet ownership has costs and restrictions. Nobody forced them to get a dog. Nobody forced them to rent. This argument is clean because it is true. The landlord's interest is real. The damage risk is real. The financial burden of pet-caused damage falling on property owners who did not choose it is a genuine and legitimate concern. It becomes less clean when you observe what actually happens in practice. Pet fees and pet rent, in most jurisdictions, have no connection to actual damage caused. They are charged regardless of whether the animal ever damages anything. A 15-year-old cat who does nothing but sleep on a windowsill generates monthly pet rent, identical to an animal who shredded a couch. The fee is not compensation for damage. It is a revenue stream, and it targets a captive audience, people who already have pets, and who face the impossible choice of paying whatever is asked or surrendering the animal. Governments have noticed this dynamic, and they have responded in two completely opposite directions simultaneously, which tells you everything about where this debate actually is. In Washington, D.C., the Pets and Housing Amendment Act of 2024, now known as Roscoe's Law, named after the late rescue dog of the bill's sponsor. Councilmember Robert White caps pet security deposits at 15% of a tenant's monthly rent and limits pet rent to 1% of monthly rent per dog, with all other non-refundable fees prohibited, effective October 20. It also ensures that at least one D.C. area shelter will allow unhoused residents to stay with their companion animal. In California, Assembly Bill 2216 attempted to go further, prohibiting blanket no-pet policies in rental housing and making California the first state to mandate pet acceptance. It was withdrawn in July 2024, following strong opposition and persistent lobbying efforts from rental property associations and industry organizations. The same lobbying dynamic that kept cat declawing legal for 7 years in California buried the pet housing bill before it reached a vote. In New York, a bill in the state assembly is proposing tax credits for pet expenses up to $150 per pet for everyday costs and up to $300 for veterinary expenses, capped at $900 per year for 2 pets combined. The logic is inverted from the pet tax. Instead of charging people more for having pets, the state would effectively subsidize pet ownership as a recognized social good. And in some municipalities, the conversation is moving in the other direction entirely, toward not just fees but hard limits on how many pets a household can legally own, with enforcement mechanisms that treat multi-pet households as a regulatory problem to be solved. This is the collision point, the place where individual freedom and collective governance run directly into each other. Not in the abstract, but in the specific, personal, deeply felt question of how many cats you are legally allowed to have in your own home. The multi-pet household question is where this debate gets genuinely complicated and where the luxury framing enters. The argument for limiting and taxing multi-pet households goes like this. Pets impose costs on everyone around them. They generate noise, odors, and allergens in shared housing. They strain local animal control resources. They contribute to the shelter system when they breed or when owners cannot manage them. 2 pets imposes more of these costs than 1 pet, and 3 more than 2, in a rough but real sense. Charging more for more pets or limiting the number of pets per household is not punishing love. It is distributing the cost of a personal choice across the person who made it. The counter-argument is sharper than it sounds. Who decides what constitutes too many pets? A person who rescues 3 cats from a shelter has prevented 3 potential youth. A person who takes in a litter of kittens until they can be rehomed is performing a service the shelter system desperately needs more people to perform. The multi-pet household is, in many cases, not a luxury. It is a rescue operation run by a private citizen at their own expense. Taxing it as a luxury is not just economically wrong. It is factually wrong about what it is. The shelter system in America is in crisis. with more animals staying longer in shelters, and multiple other factors converging simultaneously, staffing and veterinarian shortages, as well as an increasing proportion of animals with greater medical and behavioral needs. Many shelters continue to face an ongoing capacity crisis. The response to that crisis depends almost entirely on private citizens choosing to adopt, foster, and keep animals. Every policy that makes multi-pet ownership more expensive, more legally precarious, or more socially stigmatized as a luxury reduces the number of people willing or able to participate in that system. The luxury framing assumes that wanting 2 cats instead of 1 is analogous to wanting a second car or a boat. It is not for many multi-pet households, particularly foster carers, rescue volunteers, and lower-income households where animals provide essential emotional support and companionship. The second or third animal is not a luxury. It is a necessity that the system is actively trying to price out of reach. Here is where individual freedom meets its actual limit in this debate, and it is worth being honest about where that limit is. The freedom argument, that people should be able to own however many pets they want without government interference in their own homes, runs into a specific and real constraint. The difference between owning a home and renting one. A homeowner with 4 cats in a house they own outright is exercising genuine individual freedom. The cats affect no one else's property. No one else's investment is at stake. The argument for letting that person live exactly as they choose, without surcharges or limits, is essentially unanswerable. A renter with 4 cats in an apartment, they share a building with 30 other families, is a different situation. The landlord has a property interest. The neighbors have interests. The building has infrastructure that animals can damage. The freedom argument is real here too, but it has to be balanced against the interests of everyone else. The decision affects the question that the law is trying to answer across every city and state currently navigating this debate is where exactly that balance lands. How much can a landlord charge before the fee stops being compensation for risk and starts being a tax on a lifestyle? How many pets can a local government prohibit before the ordinance stops protecting community welfare and starts controlling how people form emotional attachments in their own homes? There is no clean answer. There has never been a clean answer. And the legislatures and courts that are working through this right now in DC, in California and New York, in dozens of other jurisdictions are not going to produce one. What they are going to produce is a patchwork of local laws, cap structures, exemptions, and enforcement mechanisms that will determine, for tens of millions of American renters, whether keeping a pet in their home is a right, a privilege, or a luxury subject to permanent additional taxation. The stakes are not abstract. 4.2 million shelter animals were adopted into loving homes in 2024. 607,000 animals were euthanized. The gap between those two numbers is the gap between a functional system and a failing one. And the primary driver of that gap, the reason animals enter shelters in the first place at rates that adoption cannot keep pace with, the cost and difficulty of keeping pets in American housing. $75 monthly pet rent charge. That prices a lower income renter out of keeping their cat is a cat that eventually enters a shelter. Every no-pet policy that forces a tenant to choose between their apartment and their dog is a dog that gets surrendered. The pet tax, in all its forms, is not a neutral revenue mechanism. It has consequences that extend well beyond the landlord-tenant relationship and into the animal welfare system that every American city is currently struggling to sustain. That is the argument that the pet tax debate almost never surfaces clearly because it requires connecting the fee on a lease addendum to the euthanasia numbers in an ASPCA report. And that connection is not obvious until you look at it directly. Once you look at it directly, it is hard to look away. America spends $150 billion a year on pet care. 66% of households own a pet. 88% of those people consider that pet a member of their family. And the housing system that 35% of Americans rent from has decided that family membership costs extra monthly, indefinitely, regardless of whether any damage is ever done. DC just capped it. California tried to reform it and failed. New York is considering subsidizing it instead of taxing it. Dozens of other jurisdictions have done nothing. And 607,000 animals were euthanized in shelters in 2024 in a country that considers those animals family, because the system could not find them homes. The pet tax is not a minor policy footnote. It is a question about what kind of relationship between humans and animals this country is willing to structure its laws around, about whether emotional bonds that 88% of pet owners describe as familial deserve the same policy. Consideration as bonds the government already recognizes and protects. And right now, In most of America, the answer is yes, but it will cost you an extra $75 a month. If this story made you think about a lease you signed, or a pet you have, or a policy you've never considered the consequences of, share it. Because 607,000 animals were euthanized in American shelters last year. That number has a cause. The pet tax is part of it. And most people making the decisions that produced it have never thought through the chain clearly enough to see it. What do you think? Should monthly pet rent be capped or banned? Should multi-pet households be taxed as a luxury or subsidized as a social good? Tell us in the comments. And subscribe, because next week, the story will be just as important and just as ignored.